Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is Suspects and Spirits, and I'm your host, Taylor Seraphin. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope you had a nice long weekend, got to enjoy maybe some family time or delicious food. Maybe you went into a food coma. I did. We had a really nice, kind of low key Thanksgiving. It was just us and the girls. We went to a hockey game the next day. We went and saw the Roadrunners kill it. They played against the Canucks and they won. We demolished them. It was such a good game. Oh my God, it was such a good game. Nobody scored until like the last 5 seconds of the second period. They came out to play. It was amazing. Then we went to the Cheesecake Factory and we had dinner there. I don't know why we chose to do that on Black Friday, but we did. The mall was so crowded. The only Cheesecake Factory we have is near a mall. So parking was impossible, but Cheesecake Factory had there was like no wait time. So that was nice. Delicious dinner. Yeah. And then today we have a little party, a little shindig to go to. So it's been a busy weekend. And I'm so sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. She just can't get enough of us, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, I have a crazy ass story for you guys today. I'm going to jump right into it because it's long. It's a long one. This is a paranormal story. And I had not heard of this one before. Some possession cases, this is a possession case. Okay. Some of them I feel can be really exaggerated. You hear them, you kind of nod along, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, there's probably a medical explanation for much of this that happened that nobody, bothered to look into. And then there's stories like this one. This is easily one of the most brutal, disturbing, and heavily documented possession cases I have ever researched, I've ever heard of. And it happened in the mid 1800s, like way before Hollywood tropes, long before The Exorcist, long before people really knew how to make a spectacle out of this kind of thing. Now, of course, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. You can believe whatever you want. I'm not even a super crazy religious person. I definitely think that there are, higher powers. I think that there are lower powers like, demons, the devil, all of that. I don't think we fully understand any of it. And I don't think we're ever really meant to. But this story has a lot of crazy shit, just crazy shit going on in here. So this is a 2-year ordeal that happened to this young woman. Her name, and I'm so sorry if I butcher any of this. It's German. So I'm really sorry if it sounds ridiculous when I say it, but her name was Gottliebin Dittus. And she was a young woman in rural Germany whose haunting didn't just involve voices or convulsions. We're talking like objects coming out of her body. You guys, nails, glass, long wires that got twisted into her tongue somehow, and even living creatures. We're talking poltergeist activity witnessed by an entire neighborhood, like a whole ass village, and then a Lutheran pastor who documented everything because he wanted the truth to be known, even though he really worried that people would think he was crazy. He was insane. He did it anyways. So that's why I am able to tell you this story today. This is the kind of case that makes you sit back and go, what the fuck? If any of this is real, what happened in that house? I need to know more. And I got as much information as I possibly could. It can be kind of hard with these old timey stories, but thankfully, he documented a lot of it. There was a book about it. He didn't make any money off of this book, but there's a lot of information. So here I am. Here we go. Before we dive in fully, though, I need you guys to understand the severity of this case. It's really disturbing. It's really horrific. It is grotesque and it is dark. It will stick with you. So I just needed to get that out of the way. The awful events that I'm about to tell you come from a Lutheran pastor, as I mentioned before. His name was Johann or Johann, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Johann Christoph Blumhardt. This encounter was very overwhelming for him, and at one point he actually wondered if he should just not ever talk about it again. But superiors that he was involved with, his religious superiors, insisted that he write it all down. So he did. It's very well documented, and you can look into it yourself. Of course, there are skeptics. There are going to be skeptics for any of these stories that we do. But I'm just here to tell you what happened. All right. So we are going to dive in. We're going to start with Johann. Johann was born in 1805 in southwest Germany. And even though his family were handymen, craftsmen, by the age of 12, he had actually read the Bible twice and he fell in love with scripture. He wanted to pursue this as a career. So after studying theology, mathematics, history, philosophy at, oh, I'm so sorry. I think it's Tübingen University. I'm really sorry. I probably messed that up. Please correct me, somebody. He worked as a teacher after he graduated. He worked as a teacher in Switzerland and then as a junior clergyman back in Germany. And this is where he met his wife. And when he was 33, he moved to the small rural village of Möttlingen. Okay, I'm really sorry. Möttlingen. Just go with it. There, he took up the role of the new church pastor. And on Tuesday, July 31st in 1838, the locals gathered around to welcome him. And at the time, there were 874 people in that parish, just that parish, and 535 of them were living in Möttlingen itself. And then the rest were living in a nearby village called Hogstedt. The locals were kind of a tough crowd when it came to preaching. The current pastor, his name was Pastor Barth, and he said that they were really bored of preaching and often fell asleep in the pews, which can you blame them? Because same. I mean, sometimes, listen, I'm sorry. I know a lot of people like going to church. I personally, I can't sit there for that long, especially a Catholic mass. Like growing up, going to Catholic mass, it was really long. And then you're kneeling and you're standing and anyways. So these people, they were a tough crowd. They were really tired of the preaching, but that would very soon change because the events that would unfold around this tiny, beautiful village and a beautiful home would come to both shock and horrify the villagers and keep them wide awake in those pews. So, how did this all begin? It began with a local woman, as I said before. Her name was Gottliebin Dittus. She was originally from the town of Möttlingen, and in February of 1840, she and her siblings actually moved into a ground floor apartment of a house to start a better life. Their parents, unfortunately, had died really young, leaving behind all five of their children. So there was two boys and three girls, and they were all unmarried at this time. They were relatively young, and they moved in together hoping to build a stable home. Life was really, really hard for them. The family was very poor, and one brother was half blind. And then the youngest sibling, Gottliebin, who we're discussing today, she suffered from some really terrible chronic illnesses. Now, I know what you're thinking because I thought the exact same thing when I heard this story. I was like, oh, she suffers from chronic illness. There's going to be some kind of explanation at the end for this possession, right? That's what I thought too. So just stick with me. Okay, this is bonkers. Gottliebin was born on October 13th, 1815, so a Libra, and she was a very talented young woman. She had a gift for writing, poetry, and song. She loved to sing. And the previous pastor that I mentioned before, Pastor Barth, he had taught her a lot about Christianity, and she had a really, really strong religious foundation. She had worked previously as a maid in various places and was appreciated for her diligence. She was known for being, a very well-rounded, dependable person. But she did have some things that kind of set her back in life physically. Since childhood, she had suffered really strange illnesses, mostly affecting her lower abdomen. She was actually unable to urinate without a medical instrument that was given to her by a doctor. So she had that going on. And then she also had spinal issues, and that caused one of her legs to be shorter than the other, making walking really difficult for her. So she had a lot going on. Between 1836 and 1838, she also battled a really terrible fight with kidney disease. And this experience actually left her so frightened and so deeply scared of, her health issues that it actually strengthened her devotion to God and to her faith. So Gottliebin and her siblings, they all felt like this move at this time, especially, was a great fresh start for them, a chance to rebuild their life. But on the very first night that they settled in, something unusual and dark happened. That evening, the siblings all sat down for their meal, and it was tradition for them to pray before they ate, just like many people do now. The eldest brother, Andreas, he had said a prayer and thanked God for the food. And he said the prayer, "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest." And suddenly, the youngest sister, Gottliebin, she did something that made them all go, "What the fuck is happening right now?" She suddenly stiffened at the table. Her whole body went stiff right after hearing this prayer. And according to the reports, she immediately rolled her eyes backward into her head and collapsed with her hands together and fell to the ground. So of course her siblings are like, "Oh my god, she's having a seizure," right? They're very concerned for their youngest sister. They run over to her, assuming she had fainted or she's seizing. But when they turned her head and they saw her face, they were shocked. Her expression was almost ghoulish and contorted into an unnatural distortion. Her eyes were wide open, but completely unfocused, and she was just staring at nothing. So to us, modern day, this sounds like maybe a stroke, something like that, maybe half the face going numb, which would, that would make sense. It would be a logical explanation. But what happened next wasn't that logical. As she laid on the floor and her siblings were trying to help her, her face completely twisted, that is when knocking began inside the home. And at first it was very faint, like tapping, on the walls, tap, tap, tap. And then it grew louder and louder. And the family couldn't tell where it was coming from. Another family lived upstairs. Remember, they're on the ground floor of this apartment. So they were like, okay, maybe that's the neighbors. It seemed like a very obvious explanation. Neighbors are bowling again. But the knocking then moved unpredictably. Sometimes it was pounding on the ceiling, and then it would shift back to the walls. And then they heard it along the floor underneath their sister, as if something were beneath the floorboards, hammering to get out. And it didn't stop there, because then the banging began on the furniture itself. There was a very eerie knocking that traveled from the walls to the ceiling, to the furniture, to the floorboards until it was just everywhere. The family, with Gottliebin lying there, contorted, they sat frozen in fear as the knocking continued. And then the candles in the room began to flicker like crazy, but there was no wind, there was no draft, all the windows were closed. And Johann wrote that the shadows cast by the candles behaved very strangely. The family said that the shadows seemed to move independently of the candle flames. So the flames would move one way, and the shadows would do something completely different. Like figures were shifting around the room. And it didn't end there either. The floor of the house began to tremble, only slightly, but enough to make the table shake where they were just previously trying to sit down for dinner. And all the plates were starting to rattle. Then each person felt something physically press against their body. All of these siblings did, as though a weight were being pushed onto them. At that moment, Gottliebin suddenly sat upright and gasped for air. And she said something extremely unsettling. She said, quote, "Something is here. It does not want us to pray," end quote. After this horrifying incident at the dinner table, Gottliebin continued to have these episodes. She was suffering immensely. She would experience fevers one moment and then chills the next. And sometimes she would just lie completely motionless for hours upon hours. And her siblings would watch her in complete terror, in complete helplessness. When she would lay there for just hours completely still, they were afraid that she had died, and they were staring at her corpse until they noticed the slightest little trace of, shallow breathing. And this went on for quite some time. Doctors could not figure out what was going on. They had absolutely no explanation for her. The house was also starting to feel really unfamiliar. They tried so hard to explain knocking as, normal building noises, but soon after Johann got involved, he said it became impossible to ignore, that this knocking grew louder and sharper and more insistent, echoing from the rooms even when the family sat in silence. Sometimes the knocking came from inside the wood beams themselves. One night, the knocking grew so loud and so violent that it shook the entire house. And during that moment, Gottliebin suddenly manifested bizarre and scary behavior. As the pounding continued, she began making sounds that were very unnatural, like deep growls and groans. Her body tensed severely and her limbs trembled, and then her lips would curl back before she would shudder and then spit out a thick, foamy substance from her mouth. Those who witnessed this happening, like the siblings and even a family friend, later said that it was as if something unseen had been forced out of her body. At night, she found her own hands being crossed over her chest by an unseen force, as though an invisible presence were pressing them into place. She also became really unpleasant and inexplicable in her behavior. They were like, who is this person? Like this godly woman who loved singing and poetry. Something about her had just completely changed, and it was repelling. People didn't really want to be around her anymore because she was just really unpleasant. She would say and do bizarre things, and she was just kind of foul. Now, up until this moment in time, the siblings had tried to keep all of this as private as possible. They did not want people judging their sister or judging them. But they realized very soon that they needed to seek help for her, because if this was a medical condition, what was it and what were they supposed to do? So by the fall of 1841, her nightly torments had become so extreme that Gottliebin finally agreed to meet with Johann, because remember, she was at heart a religious and godly woman. So he greeted her and he was ready to help, but she still didn't tell him the full truth of what was going on at the time because she was afraid of judgment. So they discussed only her general struggles. And Johann had no idea about the poltergeist activity going on in the home. And he couldn't really understand like the depth of her suffering or offer much meaningful guidance. He was really confused. He was like, okay, so you just need guidance right now. I'm not sure why you came to me. If this is like a medical condition, you need to go to a doctor. And she tried to explain, the doctors don't really know what's going on. So she wasn't telling him anything about the poltergeist activity or the weird things that she had been seeing and hearing. Then in December of 1841, she was struck with another condition. She got a really severe skin infection on her face called erysipelas. I think that's how you pronounce it. Someone correct me if that's not right. Today, this is really treatable with antibiotics, but at the time, remember, this is the 1800s, it could be really deadly because it could get infected. So she became critically ill with this infection, and it lasted until February of 1842. During this time, Johann had visited her at home, wanting to ensure her well being as her pastor and just to provide some, friendliness and guidance. But every time he went to visit her, he found her behavior really off putting. He wrote that during this illness, he said he rarely wanted to visit her because her behavior was so repelling. Whenever he walked in, she would twist her head away and refuse to answer his greeting. And when he suggested prayer with her, she would put her hands together. But as soon as he began praying, she would pull them apart in defiance. But it was almost like something was forcing them apart. Like she wanted to pray, but she couldn't physically keep her hands together. Her family told Johann that before and after his visits, she behaved completely normal. And poor Johann, he was like, I'm trying to help. But he came to believe that she despised his presence so much that he actually stopped visiting her. But even though he stopped visiting her, he was like, listen, your sister needs medical help. So you need to keep seeking help for her. I can't keep coming back here because she clearly doesn't want me here. And he was like, honestly, this is really off putting and I'm getting weird vibes. So thankfully, the siblings did seek more medical help for her and she recovered. But up until this point, Johann, he really didn't know anything about the poltergeist activity. He just thought Gottliebin had really disturbing behavior and her demeanor had completely changed. But that would all come to change in April of 1842 when two of her siblings visited him again in desperation. They were like, please come back and help our sister. Things are getting worse. And he was like, how can I help? I'm not a doctor. And they finally told him everything that was going on about the poltergeist activity, their home filling with knocking sounds, They said the entire neighborhood was now hearing them. Something was going on. And then they revealed something even more alarming. Gottliebin claimed that she was seeing a strange woman in the house. Now, come to find out later on, this woman had been a local, but she had died 2 years earlier. At this time, when all of this was occurring, Gottliebin didn't know that. She always saw this apparition in the same place, standing beside her bed. She even knew the woman's name. And each time this dead woman appeared, she held something in her arms. It was a child, but not an alive child. She was holding a deceased child. Gottliebin said that the woman with this child would stand silently beside her bed, just watching her. But on other occasions, the woman would slowly step closer. And when she did, the apparition would speak, saying, quote, "I just want some peace. Give me peace on earth and I will not return." End quote. I would probably pee my pants, and I would probably at this point say, I don't want to live here anymore. But the siblings, they didn't move, and they asked Johann whether Gottliebin should try to communicate with this ghost. And Johann, he was like, "No, absolutely not." He was horrified by this suggestion. He said under no circumstances should she ever engage with it. He told them that acknowledging things like this can actually make it worse. And he even said that there was a possibility that this apparition might be a product of her imagination. Maybe she's hallucinating. Maybe she's really sick. Maybe she's seeing stuff. We don't know. It's the 1800s. But he was very adamant that any attempt to converse with spirits, real or imagined, could lead to horrifying madness, which is very good advice, I feel, especially for the times. And instead, he advised that Gottliebin start praying earnestly and trusting that in time the matter would just resolve on its own, which, thoughts and prayers. So after this conversation, Johann made a special request. He asked whether a family friend could sleep in the room with Gottliebin to watch over her. He felt that she needed support, especially since one of the sisters worked away from home, another was rarely present, and then another just wasn't much help at all. So they found a family friend who agreed to stay with Gottliebin, especially at night. Now, on this first night that the friend stayed in the room with her, she began hearing that faint knocking sound again. And then she noticed a really soft shimmer of light moving across the room. And this light drifted toward one of the beds, almost as if it were guiding her. So she became really curious and she crouched down to look beneath the bed. And down there, she found a piece of paper, half covered in soot. It was so stained that the writing was just illegible. You couldn't read it, but it was definitely there. There was something written on the paper. Along with the paper, she discovered some very small coins, including 3 silver crowns. Each coin had been wrapped in paper, and each wrapper was filled with soot as well. They didn't know where the soot was coming from. And that's when some of them started to wonder if the writing on this paper and the soot, all of it was some kind of spell. A couple of weeks later, another mysterious light was seen in the house by this same friend, and when they followed it again, they uncovered more items buried in the floor. There were small bones and more packets of powder wrapped in squares of paper. These powders were sent to a nearby town for scientific analysis. I think the town was Claw or something. I can't pronounce it. But it was sent to a nearby town for scientific analysis. But even though nothing unusual was found, it made Johann very uncomfortable. So he decided that they needed to gather all the objects and burn them. But unfortunately, this didn't stop the activity. It actually seemed to make things much, much worse. The knocking and banging became unbearable. It had previously only happened at night, but now the pounding occurred during the day as well. Locals would walk past the house and they would stop in shock at the constant racket coming from inside this home. Sometimes even when no one was present, even when Gottliebin wasn't home, because there were times when she would, try to go out in town and have a normal day, and it would still happen when no one was there. But the knocking was at its worst when Gottliebin was present. On one occasion, multiple witnesses saw a table in the house begin knocking on its own. And then it started to shake really violently and it rose into the air and then slammed back down in front of everyone. So, needless to say, news of this haunting and possible possession started to spread throughout the village, and people from nearby towns began visiting just out of curiosity. So, Johann feared that this public attention and this hysteria would actually make this much, much worse than it needed to be. So he arranged for a secret nighttime investigation. He was like, instead of all of these people coming to investigate it on their own, we need our own investigation to see what's going on. Because he wanted to put all these rumors to rest. So he invited a sizable group of witnesses. There were 6 to 8 respected townspeople. There was Moses Stranger. He was a relative of the Dittus family. And even the mayor of Möttlingen came. He was like, we're going to investigate what's going on and we're going to put all these rumors to rest. So on June 3rd of 1842, they arrived around 10 p.m. As soon as Johann stepped into the house that night, 2 massive pounding sounds echoed from the bedroom, followed by a rapid hammering sound. Whatever was making the noise almost seemed excited, but also enraged by the Reverend's arrival with his group. There were so many witnesses, guys, 6 to 8 people, okay? So many witnesses that they spread throughout the house. Some were upstairs, some were outside, and after a little while of hearing the pounding, they gathered on the lower floor and confirmed that they were all hearing the same thing, and none of them could figure out where it was coming from. The report emphasized how actually loud this was. Distant villagers later on said that it sounded like a New Year's gun salute, like people were shooting off guns. It was so incredibly loud. And for the next 3 hours, the witnesses saw a bizarre string of events. A chair suddenly leapt into the air as though someone had kicked it from beneath, and then the windows started rattling without anyone touching them. Then something strange began pouring from the ceiling. Are you ready? It was sand. It began raining sand. Much more concerning than if it were raining men. No one was saying hallelujah to this. And at 1 a.m., Gottliebin said that she could see this mysterious figure again in the house. So everyone is like, what's going on? And eventually they're all really exhausted and they ended the investigation. So Johann arranged for Gottliebin to be moved to another home for her safety. But relocating her actually didn't stop anything. Her half-blind brother remained behind in the house that night, and he later described some other frightening experiences, but they weren't really detailed in the report. So now, during this investigation that happened, it became really clear that although the pounding moved throughout the house, it settled on a certain area of the floor. On Friday afternoon, they decided to come back and dig at the spot where the sound had been the strongest because they got a little curious. They were like, wait a minute, we all realized that this is happening. Let's go dig that up. The floorboards were loose and they were easy to remove, and Moses Stranger began digging in the soil beneath them. As his fingers sank into the dirt, a small flame flickered up from the ground and then it just completely vanished. So they kept digging, of course, and they found more squares of powder wrapped in paper and more coins and a strange pot filled with another pot turned upside down on top of it like a lid. And when they removed the lid, they discovered that the bottom pot was filled with soil and bones. What kind of bones, you ask? I will tell you in just a moment. Everyone, upon seeing this collectively, was like, what the fuck is happening? So rumors, they'd already begun to spread throughout the village that Gottliebin was seeing a ghost. And very soon, people came to the conclusion that this ghost she was seeing was the spirit of a local child murderer, which was supposedly why the apparition carried a deceased child, which is really horrific and dark and terrifying. So finding the bones was scary enough, but when a gravedigger examined them, he confirmed that they were bones of a child. So panic just started to overwhelm the entire community. And to calm things down, Johann collected the bones and other items and he took them to the town of Call, I think is how you say it, Calw, with the mayor. They handed everything to a man named Dr. Kaiser. He was a district physician who had treated Gottliebin before. And after examining the bones, the doctor contradicted the gravedigger's conclusion. He told Johann and the mayor that the bones were not human, they were just bird bones. So this was really reassuring in some ways. They were like, well, it's not a kid, but to them it looked a bit ritualistic. And the arrangement of the items led Johann to another very disturbing conclusion. In his view, someone had been practicing black magic in that home, drawing relentless spirits back to the place where the rituals were performed originally. At this point, Johann wanted desperately to just end the fear and the confusion among the villagers. He was like, this is getting crazy. Everyone go the fuck home and leave this poor family alone. Let's all calm down. So he's looking for any way to just like put a rest to all of this. He's a little concerned, right? He's a man of faith. So of course in the 1800s they're like, oh God, witchcraft. That's not good. But he was also a man who believed that there was also an explanation for things. And he was not one of those people who thought that witches should be burned at the stake. And he actually had made claims saying that he thought the witch trials were ridiculous and excessive. He was like, that was insane. He basically thought that it was stupid. So just desperately, wanting all of this fear and confusion to end, Johann arranged for Gottliebin to stay with a female cousin and later with her uncle, which was the father of Moses Stanger. Johann required the Stanger family to maintain very strict secrecy so that Gottliebin could have some kind of peace while this situation calmed down. He was very concerned for, her mental and emotional well-being. He did not want the public to keep interfering in her life, which was very nice of him. He especially feared that the villagers might conclude that she was possessed by the devil, and he believed that this could put her in danger. He was a pretty logical, level-headed guy. They had all seen what happened during the witch trials, and he was afraid that this was going to happen again. So keeping her out of the house was a very wise decision because outsiders were now flocking to see this haunted home. And there were actually reports of people begging Johann to let them spend the night inside to see for themselves. Even 3 Catholic priests from the neighboring region of Baden, they came and they asked permission to stay in the room. Johann, of course, refused all such requests, and the house was kept strictly secured. Fortunately, the town watchman lived across the street, and he helped keep people away. So I will say, like this story, they tried really hard to not make a spectacle of this, which is very rare for possession cases. Typically, they're just kind of allowing everybody to come see what's going on. But despite all of their best efforts and even moving Gottliebin in with her uncle and her female cousin, in 1842, Johann received some very alarming news. The paranormal activity had followed her to this new house. The knocking and convulsions were back, and now the events were even more horrific. One Sunday, Johann visited Gottliebin at the new location, along with several of her female friends. He said it was a, quote, dreadful experience. They all sat watching as awful convulsions just took over her body. Johann sat really far back, but even from a distance, he could clearly see her body twisting in impossible ways. They said, this is not a seizure. This is not anything we've ever seen before medically. She would wrench her arms into unnatural angles and her head bent sharply to the side. Her torso arched upward as if it was being pulled by some kind of force, and foam would just pour from her mouth, just like it had at the other house. Now, this may sound like, the script of a horror movie that you might see today, The Exorcist. But guys, I can't stress to you enough, these details came directly from Johann's written account. And then there was a physician who also witnessed this episode, and he was like, I have never seen any of this in my life. There's an actual quote. It says, quote, I have never seen anything like this in my life, end quote, from this physician. So up to this point, Johann had been very cautious about using the word demonic. He was like, I'm not tying that word to this. I'm sure there's an explanation. But as he watched, these horrible distortions of her body combined with furniture moving, pounding, strange objects found on the floor, he began to doubt that this was just an illness. He felt like there was some kind of malignant presence filling the room. So he actually finally reached a breaking point. He was unable to just sit and watch any longer. He felt horrible for Gottliebin. So he leapt from his chair and he rushed over to her side and he grabbed her stiff, cold hands and he forced them together in prayer. More forcefully than he had ever acted before, he shouted, "Gottliebin, put your hands together and pray. Lord Jesus, help me. We have seen enough of what this evil can do. Now let us see what Jesus can do." And that is a direct quote. Within seconds, Gottliebin came out of her state. Her convulsions stopped, and she repeated his prayer word for word. Everyone that was there was completely stunned. She seemed totally at peace. But unfortunately, this peace was fleeting. Later that night, Johann was at home when a messenger arrived in a complete panic. After a very calm evening, Gottliebin had fallen into her worst convulsions yet. So Johann, very concerned, he rushed back, and when he arrived, he said her demeanor was, quote, utterly monstrous. This particular episode lasted for 3 hours before doing a prayer calmed her again. The next night at 9 p.m., it began again. And Johann wrote that whenever she looked at him, her eyes bulged really wide and wild, and they would just glare at him with a dreadful expression. She made very threatening gestures toward him and actually was clawing at his face at one point, admitting she wanted to gouge out his eyes. But no matter how hard she tried, she could never reach him. And this frustrated her, or whatever this entity was, and she slammed her hands against the bed in rage. Now, at this point, Johann, if he had any doubt still that an evil spirit was involved, this next moment would completely destroy that. Because this is when the quote unquote demon began to speak. Johann was with Gottliebin again, along with several witnesses, and he always insisted on others being present to confirm what he saw. He was like, I do not want anyone just relying on my narrative. I need other people here to understand what's going on, because he knew that otherwise people might doubt him and call him insane. So during this time, Gottliebin was laying there in a relatively normal state. She was pretty calm, but then something seemed to enter her again, and her body lifted slightly, and Johann immediately began to pray in the name of Jesus. Her eyes rolled back again, and she spoke in a voice that stunned every single person in the room. This was not her voice. She said, quote, "I cannot bear to hear the name," end quote. Johann wrote that when the witnesses heard this, everyone shuddered, like everyone got the chills. And he did not initially assume that this was the devil or demonic because, again, he's being very careful about that. He was like, maybe it's the ghost, maybe there is a poltergeist activity, but I wouldn't go as far as to call this demonic, right? So he confronted the voice and he interrogated it. So I'm going to tell you guys quote for quote what was exchanged during this interrogation. Starting with Johann, quote, "Can't you rest in peace in your grave?" "No." "But why not? This is how I have to pay for my sins." "Did you not confess all your sins to me?" "No. I murdered 2 children and buried them in a field." "Can't you help yourself? Can't you pray?" "I can't pray." "Don't you know Jesus who forgives all sins?" "I cannot stand the name." "Are you alone?" "No." "Who is with you?" "The most terrible one." End quote. So that was the exchange when he was talking with whatever was possessing Gottliebin. Now, Johann believed that this, quote, most terrible one was a reference to the devil. So at this point, he's like, okay, maybe I'm a little in over my head here, and maybe it's not just a ghost. And the voice continued speaking, confessing that it had practiced witchcraft and become bound to evil. So Johann asked if he could pray for the spirit, and after hesitation, it agreed. So he prayed, telling it could no longer remain in Gottliebin. He was like, you got to get out. Okay, this ain't your home no more. He said, not in my house. But then the voice became really sorrowful and it started begging to stay. It was like, please, please let me stay. And he said, no, you may not stay in Gottliebin. And then it went from sorrowful to full on demanding to stay inside her. And Johann sternly commanded it to leave. Gottliebin then slammed her hands on the bed and suddenly it was gone. But this was not the end. This is just the tip of the iceberg. These possession episodes continued, and Johann began to conclude that multiple entities were actually present, not just one. And he eventually referred to them as demons. So he was really hesitant before, but after all of these exchanges, he was like, nah, I think we're dealing with some demons here. So Gottliebin grew very violent very quickly. Not toward Johann necessarily, but toward others that were present during these possessions. She even struck the mayor at one point, and at times, even herself, tearing at her hair, punching herself, and smashing her head against the wall. It was brutal, you guys. Johann grew desperate. His friends begged him to walk away, but he was like, no, I'm not going to leave this poor girl. He was like, what would happen to her if I just abandoned her? And then he also feared that the community would place blame on him if anything were to happen to her. So, despite all of this supernatural evidence before him, he wondered where God was in all of this and why Gottliebin had to suffer in such degrading ways. And things only got worse. He estimated that there were at one point 14 demons in her, and then that raised to 175. And before we knew it, guys, there were 425 demons in her. Now, I feel that that is excessive. If you're going to possess someone, like one is plenty. You don't need 425 of you guys in there. One is good. All right, one and done. Get out of there. That's rude. So the number kept increasing, and there were so many encounters, each blending into the next, that he struggled to remember them all, and it became one long, relentless nightmare. So all of this continued, and one night, Gottliebin said that she saw a large group of spectral figures gathering around her bed. This time, though, there was another woman attending, and she also saw the figures, confirming Gottliebin's vision. So it wasn't just Gottliebin, it was this other woman who was there. She was like, yeah, I see them too. And then the attacks escalated. Gottliebin would be resting and then would awaken suddenly with the sensation of a burning hot hand gripping her throat. And witnesses actually saw burn marks appear on her neck right before their eyes. The doctor was called in and he was, quote, utterly astonished. He was like, where did those burn marks come from? How is this happening? Now, I do want to make it clear that Gottliebin, she wasn't confined to her bed all the time. There were some calm moments when she went into town for fresh air, just to get some normalcy in her day. So on good days, because this wasn't every single day, she would go out and just walk around town. But even then, she would collapse. She would just be wandering around in town, and then she would fall and start screaming. She was like, something has my ankles. And she would writhe on the ground like a worm. And Johann he was completely heartbroken by her decline. He felt horribly for her. Her siblings were beside themselves. No one knew what to do. All of the doctors were like, the fuck if I know? They were like, nothing's wrong. We can't figure it out. Johann became even more desperate to help her when Gottliebin began expressing a desire for her own death. During one possession episode, in a brief moment of clarity, she cried out, quote, for God's sake, I do not want this, end quote. They said it was pitiful. It was pathetic. It was sad and horrific. She was miserable. And this is a trigger warning. There is going to be some talk of self-harm and suicide here. So just a warning. One of the eeriest moments occurred when she reached for a rope near her bed. And before anyone could react, she leapt up, wrapped the rope around a ceiling beam, and fashioned a loop and then slipped her head through it. But then a flash of lightning happened outside and caught her attention, and she completely snapped out of the trance and she stopped. So this all happened within less than a minute. Johann later asked in disbelief why there was even a rope near her bed in the first place. He was like, why would someone put a rope near a suicidal woman? What is wrong with you guys? And no one, including Gottliebin, could explain where the rope came from. It was as if the rope had just appeared out of nowhere simply to facilitate her act of hanging herself, like to entice her. And what was even stranger was how everyone just marveled at how she quickly jumped up and tied this around the beam and then skillfully tied this loop, a skill she did not have. It was as though something was helping her do it. Later that night, that same night at 8 p.m., a storm was raging outside when Johann returned to check on her. And this is very disturbing. He found her in bed, completely covered in blood. It had been soaked through her clothes and upper body, and all she could say was, quote, the figures, end quote. No one knew where this blood came from. Everyone was horrified, and he prayed and she screamed, and a horrible, horrible voice burst from her in a manic, evil laughter. Johann continued praying, and then the voice grew so angry, just furious. And he wrote that the full force of the demon's rage and despair erupted, and many terrifying cries filled the room. Wailing, lamenting, it was as if it was more than one. And according to reports, the demon said, quote, "Now everything is lost. Everything is betrayed. You're completely ruining us. The entire pact is breaking apart. Everything is over. Everything is falling into confusion. You are to blame with your endless praying. There are 1,067 of us, and of those still alive, there are many, many more. They have signed their names in blood with the death, with the devil, with the devil, with the devil." End quote. So that's a lot. Johann wrote that was what was said. So, they're upset. They're not happy that he's praying. And the moment the demon cried out all of those words, the howling of the entities, the flashing of the lights outside, the thunder rolling, the torrential rain hammering the house, all of it mixed with the sound of Johann's prayers. And he wrote that these elements combined into a scene that he felt was impossible to convey in words. He said there is no amount of imagination that could ever come close to the reality of that moment during the storm-battered night of August 1842. That, to me, is a pretty terrifying scene. Like, it is something you would see in a horror movie. Him praying, I can just hear it and see it all happening in my head. But these accounts are way before anything that we ever saw in Hollywood. Gottliebin continued seeing these figures, and some of them would plead through her, asking Johann for permission to attend his church services, which is bizarre. They said they wanted to be freed of evil, and Johann agreed to allow some of them come to the church. And that makes me go, buddy, maybe don't do that. I don't know. Maybe they're trying to trick you. Like, don't invite them there, That's just, maybe don't. But when Gottliebin attended services with him, preaching from the pulpit, she told him that she could see the figures appearing in the church too. She said that they would crowd around the pulpit, trying to get at Johann while he spoke, which again, I say, shouldn't have brought him in there. Shouldn't have said yes. Be like, no, I cast you out, you evil spirits. You are not welcome here. That's all you got to say, Johann. You don't need to have everyone join your congregation. Now, Johann himself, he did not see these figures, obviously, but he admitted that he felt as if something frightening might be happening around him during his sermons. Like, he felt very unsettled because he had told these evil spirits that they could come to his church, probably. And strangely, instead of frightening him, it made him feel more bold. He got a little more confident. So the rest of the report describes various conversations that he had with these entities, moving from defiant to tearful to begging not to be cast out into the abyss of hell. And some of them even spoke about their original origins. A few of them claimed to have come from America. Then, on February 8th of 1843, Gottliebin told Johann that during one of her trances, she had a very intense experience, something that sounded like a nightmare. And Johann believed it may have been real. She said it felt as though she were carried away by someone with extraordinary speed, flying over the land and the sea, hovering above the surface. She passed over countries and cities and over ships and seas, clearly seeing their crews and even hearing them speak. Eventually, she arrived at the summit of a high mountain, and from the details she gave, Johann guessed that she may have been in the West Indies. On this island, she was taken to the top of a mountain where a massive opening spewed fire and smoke, so, a volcano. In the valley below, she saw cities and villages collapsing and dust rising into the air. During this vision, she watched the demons that had tormented her being cast into the fire of the mountain. About 1,000 of them, she said. And each one rushed at her, trying to grab her and drag her down with them, but none of them succeeded. So she watched them sink into the inferno, and then just as suddenly, she was carried back across the mountains and seas at an impossible speed once again, returning to her home in Germany. Pretty vivid dream. Now, he said he could not vouch for its accuracy, of course, but shortly after, newspapers started reporting a terrible earthquake that had occurred on February 8th in the West Indies. He would read missionary reports aloud during a mission hour, and the descriptions completely transported Gottliebin back into what she had said she'd seen when she was in this spirit traveling to the West Indies. Sometimes the demons would claim that they were causing droughts and floods around the world out of anger over being driven out of Gottliebin. The voices would also chant, blood, 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 and at times, fire, fire, as though they desperately craved bloodshed and destruction. What got even crazier was the moment in the reports that described the demons hissing for blood, saying, quote, even if it's just a sheep, end quote. Now, this is crazy, and it frightened Johann because after the demons had said that, there was a local flock of sheep in their town that had just been completely thrown into chaos because a mysterious, never-before-seen dog appeared and started terrorizing the sheep. No one knew this dog. No one had seen this dog. It had just kind of appeared, and it wasn't a wolf. It was a dog. The shepherds tried to calm them, but nothing worked. The sheep were very agitated the rest of the night. And the next morning, they found 2 of the sheep completely torn apart. And do you know where the bodies of the sheep were discovered? They were sprawled out directly beneath the window of Johann's house. So interesting. Had the demons somehow gotten out into the village and killed for blood, even if it was just sheep's blood, exactly as they'd threatened they would? Did Johann orchestrate this? I would hope not. I would hope he didn't do that to prove a point, but I mean, we've seen crazier things, right? And as horrifying as all of this was, the physical terror had only just begun because, again, I say, this is a long story and this is just the tip of the freaking iceberg. What comes next, you guys, is so gruesome. It is so gruesome. I'm telling you, if this is fabricated, if this is fake, this man deserves some kind of award for his writing because holy shit, this needs to be made into a movie. In 1843, Gottliebin began vomiting up strange objects. You ready? Here's a list of the things that she vomited. Sand. Yes, she started vomiting up sand. Shards of glass. Yeah. Bent iron nails and shoe buckles. So she was just hawking these things up. The metal objects kept getting larger, and everyone who was there just stood there in disbelief. They were like, how? Sometimes these objects were so big that her breathing stopped entirely as they slowly forced their way upward. And then, we're not done, then came the needles. Countless needles. Sewing needles, broken knitting needles, pins. They just started coming up one at a time. Other times they were bundled together with paper and feathers. And in one instance, the needles were roughly the length of a finger. And do you know where they came out of? Not her mouth. They came out of her ear. Her ear, you guys. Johann described another horrifying moment in his report. He said he could both feel and hear needles breaking and turning inside of her skull when he laid his hands upon her. Like if you put his hand on her head, he could feel things moving around in her skull. He even had to remove needles from her eyes after seeing them shift beneath her eyelids. Oh, oh, it makes my eyes water. Oh my gosh. So many of them emerged from her upper and lower jaw, it caused excruciating pain for Gottliebin. So needles just started like pouring out of her face, essentially, which is terrifying. Sounds like a horror movie again. Um, and then, are you ready? When they examined the inside of her mouth, they found two long wires woven into the skin of her tongue. I want to say that again. They found wires woven into her tongue. Johann wrote that it took him and his wife nearly an hour to extract them from her mouth, from her tongue. And during this extraction, Gottliebin lost consciousness because it was so painful. Yes, that was written as a real thing that happened. Now, Johann, he understood how unbelievable all of this sounded. He was like, this sounds like I ripped something from a twisted fairy tale, which is why he insisted on keeping witnesses with him at all times. That means other people witnessed this too. And those witnesses confirmed all of this had happened. And what's even crazier is that everyone who saw this happen said that despite all of the wounds created as the needles pushed through her flesh, there was almost no blood, just none. So all of this was happening and she didn't bleed. Even when they pulled the needles from her skin, there was just a faint mark. There was no bleeding at all. Now, as shocking as this seems, can't seem to get worse. It did. It escalated. Now, along with these inanimate objects, witnesses began to see living things come out of her. Living things. Johann notes that he himself never personally saw the living creatures. He did not. He only saw the metal items, but multiple witnesses swore that this happened. So, I mean, take with that what you will. On one occasion, she was said to have expelled 4 enormous locusts, very much alive. Other witnesses insisted that they saw her vomit up toads and even bats. Now, this is when I said, okay, like that's, you guys, that's too far. Like this is too much. This is too much. But that's what they said. That's what they said happened. And I was not there. Johann, his accounts are all written down. He said he didn't see any of this, but the witnesses did. And perhaps the most disturbing of all was when Gottliebin, she said that a serpent, like a viper, slid up through her throat and across her lips and then out into the room, disappearing into the shadows. She announced this before anyone else saw it, but Johann wrote that he thought he had glimpsed a fast-moving streak of light shooting out of her mouth and then vanishing beneath the bed. So he didn't see it, but he was like, maybe that's what I saw. I don't really know. He couldn't confirm it. Gottliebin had just said that this happened. So they checked her afterward and they found a very strange wound on her neck, like it had bitten her, like she got a snake bite. The terror reached its peak during what Johann called the Day of the Blood. At the beginning of December of 1843, the nosebleeds began and they would not stop. Each time one started, the blood just poured. It poured out of her so heavily that it filled entire bowls to the brim. They would switch bowls and then the bleeding kept coming. So multiple bowls at a time. Witnesses were certain that she would die from the blood loss, but she never did. And what's even crazier is that the blood didn't look like your typical nosebleed. It was very dark, almost black. And it was said that it had a horrific smell. And things got worse. I don't know how, but they kept getting worse. So after the day of the blood, all the nosebleeds. One afternoon, while Johann was on his way to visit members of his congregation, he decided to stop in and check on Gottliebin. And she pointed to her head and said, quote, here in my head, something is lodged in here. If it doesn't come out, I will die, end quote. He examined the area and found nothing unusual. He was like, I don't see anything, Gottliebin. There's nothing there. Maybe it's in maybe it's in your head. Sorry. Maybe you're imagining it, right? He was like, you're sleep deprived, you're exhausted. Maybe there's nothing there, or maybe this is a medical issue. So after he examined the area and found nothing unusual, he was like, I really have to go. I have to meet my congregation, but I don't want to leave you alone. So he called Dr. Spath to come in his place. So this doctor, he stayed for 2 hours and he started noticing hard spots forming on her scalp, exactly where she had pointed. And he was convinced something significant was about to happen. But then he was suddenly called away to assist with a birth in a nearby village. Around 4 a.m., as Johann returned to the village, he saw a local running toward him in a panic, shouting, Pastor, it's urgent. And both of them rushed to Gottliebin's home. And before even reaching the doorway, Johann was hit by a very familiar, overpowering stench of dark blood. That blood they witnessed before, filling up bowls, that smell. He nearly fell backward from the smell. He said it was awful, but he pushed in and he entered, and inside, he witnessed what he called the most horrific sight he had ever seen. Gottliebin was there, sat in the middle of a small room with a bucket in front of her, half filled with blood and water. A long, wide track of blood was streaked across the floor behind her, and she was completely drenched in it. She had blood all over her. And then he saw why. As he and the witnesses watched in horror, they saw blood gushing from her ears, her nose, her eyes, and even out of the top of her scalp. And it all came from the very spots where the doctor had felt the hard lumps forming. Now, this caused commotion that was so loud and so insane that the townspeople were hanging out of their windows in the street outside, watching as others staggered out of this home in fear and shock. Like people were running out of the house when they saw what was happening to Gottliebin. And this was at 4 a.m. Johann was at a complete loss. This spectacle was very overwhelming for him, as it should be. And he did the only thing he could think to do. He prayed. And slowly, very slowly, the bleeding stopped. When they examined her, they found a bent iron nail pressing its way out of her forehead, you guys, just above her eyebrows, just pressing out of her head. And then feeling the back of her head, they detected something else twisting beneath her skin. And soon, a wooden nail emerged from the back of her skull. And after that, the bleeding finally stopped. In the days that followed, everyone desperately were just trying to understand what could possibly explain any of this. Gottliebin herself wondered if she was cursed or bewitched in some way, and she suggested that the food she was eating may have been cursed. She was like, maybe it's in the food. She had said that previously she had fed a piece of chicken to a bird outside, and the bird instantly went into a frenzy and then just died. So she was like, maybe my food is poisoned. Gottliebin had also said that the strange ghost she'd seen might have been putting objects into her body. She was like, maybe this ghost, this thing that I keep seeing is putting these inside of me. And she often described the spirits gathering around her bed, spirits that other witnesses claimed to see as well. And Gottliebin said that these entities sometimes held objects like bread, which they placed in her mouth. She believed that the nails in particular came from a man that she saw dressed as a clergyman. And one night she was walking through the street when this man approached her with nails in his hands, and he thrust them into her head. And she insisted that this was no living person, but it was some kind of apparition. Several other examples led Johann to suspect that she was a victim of sorcery, of witchcraft, but not from the living. He believed that there were dead practitioners at work here using living people to collect materials for their ritualistic torture. He was very cautious about these ideas, and in his report, he strongly condemned the past witch hunts, the witch trials and stuff that had occurred in the 1600s, calling the torture of the accused witches misguided and dangerous. He said that he refused to accuse any living person of witchcraft. He believed that falling into that type of fear and accusation would give Satan exactly what he wanted, which was division and panic and violence and ultimately destruction. But then he was like, why had all of this been targeting Gottliebin in the first place? Johann believed that the roots of her torment might be going back to her earliest days. As he got to know her story, he learned that her mother, had died 10 years earlier. Remember at the beginning, I mentioned that the parents passed when they were all very young. But while the mother was alive, I guess she often spoke of something really scary that had happened shortly after Gottliebin was born. So soon after her birth, her mother had placed her, the baby, beside her bed. But during the night, she woke up and suddenly she was filled with fear. That fear was confirmed because Gottliebin was gone. She was gone. She cried out in terror and was frantically searching for her baby. And then suddenly, she heard the sound of something hitting the floor. And when she looked over, there she was. The baby was right there. And this happened not once, but twice. Now, Johann, he was almost embarrassed to suggest this in his report, but he wondered if possibly, could this be linked to old folk beliefs of changeling children, where dark forces kidnap babies and then leave substitutes while initiating the real children into dark magic. I don't know if you guys know anything about changelings, but that's kind of the gist of it. Or was this somehow related to Gottliebin's aunt? He wondered. Apparently, this aunt was feared by the entire community, and she had always promised to show Gottliebin something and teach her something when she was 10 years old. She said it would be something remarkable and powerful. But the aunt died when Gottliebin was only 8. So that made him wonder, what was this power she was speaking of? Was she dabbling in the occult? I don't know. Apparently everyone thinks that people dabble in the occult. So Johann, he learned, and this is actually really heartbreaking, that when Gottliebin was a small child, she had repeatedly thought of ending her life. And at one point, she went into the woods with a neck scarf and she gathered some stones to build a platform. And she tied the scarf around a tree and raised it up high and then climbed onto the stones. She put her head through the scarf and then she stepped off, but the scarf tore and she tumbled to the ground. This snapped her out of the trance she was in, and she realized that she did not intentionally want to do that. She didn't even know why she just did what she did. So it was very scary when later in the exorcism, one of those demons called out, quote, "Why won't the girl die? The scarf had to tear," end quote, as if it was frustrated that she was still alive. So he's wondering if these things had been following her whole life. If something like that happened when she was very young and she didn't even mean to do it, she can't remember why she did it. And then it also happened during the exorcism, with jumping up to the beam, tying the rope, and then being taken out of the trance when she saw the lightning. It's possible, he thought, that maybe these demons had been following her whole life. But he couldn't say, and he was almost embarrassed to say that. He even wrote, "I am embarrassed to admit this." But thankfully, the battle was almost over, and it came to an end during Christmas of 1843. This had been going on for 2 years, you guys, 2 years. And by then, it wasn't just Gottliebin displaying these shocking behaviors. Her half-blind brother and her sister, Katharina, were also now showing signs of possession. In his report, Johann actually doesn't give a whole lot of details about the final confrontation because he said he was just getting really overwhelmed with writing it all down. because this had been going on for 2 years. He also said that the recall was becoming too disturbing for him to cope with, and that the minute details were impossible to retain because his survival mechanisms were kind of coming up and blacking them out. Like, he wouldn't be able to remember them because the brain does that sometimes when you witness traumatic things. But he does say in his final reports that the final battle seemed to leap to the sister, Katerina, and she hadn't shown any signs of possession before. But now she was acting like she was violently insane. She even tried to tear Johann to pieces and had to be physically restrained. When she roared and screamed, it was like 1,000 wicked voices crying out of her mouth at the same time. The final exorcism took place at midnight, and it is reported that unearthly screams and shrieks of despair were happening during this time. He said that the entire house shook with sound so loud that half of the village huddled in their homes, terrified. But then, around 2 a.m., something changed. Katharina arched her back, twisted her body into a horribly unnatural posture, and from her voice came the words, quote, "Jesus is victor. Jesus is victor," end quote. This cry was shockingly loud at first, but then it kept going on, gradually dying down. The demon's voice grew quieter and quieter over the remaining hours of that night. And after about 6 hours of this gradual reduction, the voice was completely gone by 8 a.m. And this is where the 2-year battle finally ended. Something told Johann that he could be certain of this ending. It felt different than before when things had just calmed down. It just felt different. It felt lighter. And as for Gottliebin, her ordeal had been, monumental. But when she came out of it, something unexpected and positive happened. All of her previous medical issues, from her shorter leg, her spinal issues, her chronic stomach disorders, they all vanished. They were gone. She had no abdominal pain. Her spinal issue, doctors confirmed it was no longer an issue. And then Gottliebin went on to become a very cherished member of the church and the community. And she actually went to work for Johann and his wife in their home as their house manager and their childminder. So they trusted this woman enough after all of this to look after their children and be a part of their home. Johann said that this was a testament to the change in her and that he and his wife trusted her so implicitly because of everything they had seen and how different she was afterward. This woman, who had previously wanted nothing more than to gouge out his eyes with her bare hands, was now in charge of his children and helping manage their home. Gottliebin became a very important source of counsel and advice for the Reverend when he was dealing with members of the community who were suffering with, mental health issues, illnesses, and her insight into these struggles was a very valuable asset. And with a very clear sense of admiration and respect for everything Gottliebin had been through, Johann wrote, "She had endured the fires of affliction and emerged victorious." And that, my friends, is the story of the possession of Gottliebin Dittus and her sister and brother. There wasn't a whole lot about them, but it seemed that the entities left them alone. And I think that it's also important to keep in mind that Johann Blumhardt, the man who helped her, he didn't act alone, unlike some, more modern exorcisms that take place in secret with really devastating consequences, like with the case of Anneliese Michel. Is it Michel? She died after her exorcism. She was so malnourished, and that's a terrible story. I'm not going to get into that right now, but we've seen, okay, in more modern history, how things like this can go south very, very quickly. And that did not happen with Gottliebin. So I love that this story has a happy ending. I love that she came out victorious. She persevered and became a wonderful member of the community and a trusted member of his family. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about Johann Blumhardt So I don't know what kind of person he was outside of this. I really don't. I don't know. I only know this story. So this is not me saying like, "Oh my gosh, Johann is this incredible person." Guys, I don't know a whole lot about him, and I couldn't find a whole lot about him. So that just must be the 1800s of it all. But also, like, keep in mind at this time, without Johann's protection, she would have been like burned at the stake for this at one point in her life. And because people just were crazy back then, they thought like witchcraft, burn, she's a witch. And instead, she made it through a really horrific time in her life, whether it was demons, whether it was mental illness, whether it was some kind of weird medical anomaly that we don't understand. She came out of it, and somehow her legs were now the same size, and her spinal issues had gone away. Her abdominal pain had gone away, and she was welcomed back into her community with love and affection and grace. So that to me is pretty insane. Like, she wasn't a pariah, you know? Usually after stuff like this, they would have been like, she's a witch, burn her. But she wasn't. So anyways, that is the insane story that I had for you guys today, and also a very, very long story. I love a happy ending. I do. This story though is terrifying, and I would love to hear your thoughts about it. What do you think? Go, look into it more, see what you can find. If there's anything more about Johann that I can't really find, let me know. I'd love to know more about that guy. Whether you believe in this stuff or not, it's a hell of a story to tell. So I hope you enjoyed. And I have to actually go get ready for a party. So I got to wrap this on up. But I'm so glad that you guys chose to spend some more time with me today and listen to this horrifying story. Please make sure that if you have a headache, there are no nails coming out of your head. That part, just like, oh my gosh, all the descriptions of the things that happened to her and were coming out of her, like, made my skin crawl. And that rarely happens. But that when I read those things, I was like, oh my God, you what? What? How? So, yeah. All right. Well, I love you guys. Thanks again for spending time with me today. And I hope that this both shocked you and horrified you, but also made you go, huh, interesting. And also made you want to listen to the next episode. So stick around. Stick around for that one. Next on will be a true crime case. And I hope you guys have a great day. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Be a good human. And as always, remember to trust your lizard brain. Until next time, goodbye.